Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we are in lesson 28 of the Gospel of Mark, and we're covering Mark chapter 14, verses 1 through 26. And this one's called Because He Loved Us First. It's all coming to a head here as the cross draws near for Jesus. This seems to be the one time in history when God's plan and Satan's plan seem to coincide. Satan likely thought that he was the one driving that plan, but this moment was in God's focus before the foundations of the world. 1 Peter 1, verses 17 through 21 says this, "And if you call on the Father, who without partiality judges according to each one's work, conduct yourselves throughout the time of your stay here in fear, knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things, like silver or gold, from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. He indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you, who through him believe in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God." Foreordained or preordained is difficult to grasp. It is entirely possible that God never made this decision, especially at a moment in time, but this plan existed before man was created. We tend to look upon the cross as God's perfect solution to man bringing sin into the world, but we seem to bypass the fact that God's foreknowledge of man's sin predated man's sin, and consequently was a part of God's plan. God, as always, is in the driver's seat. God uses Satan for his purposes and is also using the characters in this passion play in the same manner. Let's read our first passage. Mark chapter 14, verses 1 through 2 says this, "After 2 days it was the Passover and the feast of unleavened bread, and the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might take him by trickery and put him to death. But they said, 'Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar of the people.'" This passage makes it easy to see that God remains in control. Notice the specifics of the deceitful plans of the Sanhedrin. They definitely are planning to arrest Jesus and to kill Jesus. But most importantly, they wanted to wait until the feasts of Passover and unleavened bread had been completed. Remember, this was one of the 3 feasts of Moses where all able-bodied Jews were required to come to Jerusalem each year. Jerusalem was packed at that time, and the Sanhedrin was worried that the mob would incite riots. The Sanhedrin did not mind playing the role of a rat, but also wanted to slink away into the shadows after their deceitfulness without being noticed or identified. John gives us some additional information in his gospel. John chapter 11, verses 45 through 48 says this, "Then many of the Jews who had come to Mary and had seen the things Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things Jesus did. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, 'What shall we do? For this man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and nation.'" The Sanhedrin was not concerned with the truth. As mentioned before, the Sanhedrin was concerned with losing its own power and position. But keep in mind that the Sanhedrin wanted to wait until after the week of the Feast of Unleavened Bread and wanted to avoid Passover at all costs. But God's plan was something quite different. Passover would begin at sundown, and that is when they would celebrate with the Seder, the Passover meal. After sharing the Passover feast with his disciples, the arrest, trial, crucifixion, and death of Jesus would occur in a brief span of 18 hours or so. In Jewish tradition, a day begins at sundown, different than our tradition when a day begins at dawn. The speed of these events was amazing, as it typically took multiple days for someone to die when crucified. Many times earlier, the Jewish religious authorities had tried to lay hands on Jesus, but we are told that it was not yet time. Soon it will be time, but understand that it is God's time, not man's time. Let's read our next passage. Mark chapter 14, verses 3 through 9 says this. And being in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came, having an alabaster flask of very costly oil of spikenard. Then she broke the flask and poured it on his head. But there were some who were indignant among themselves, and said, Why was this fragrant oil wasted? For it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they criticized her sharply. But Jesus said, Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, and whenever you wish you may do them good. But me you do not have always. She has done what she could. She has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial. Assuredly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her. Many people equate Mary of Bethany with Mary Magdalene. I guess that is a possibility, but not a probability. Instead, what we should notice is that there certainly are a lot of Marys in the life of Jesus, with that Hebrew name, Mara, meaning bitterness. First, we have Mary, the mother of Jesus. We also have Mary Magdalene, and we know that Jesus removed 7 demons from her. She also was at the cross and was the first to see Jesus after his resurrection. We also see the other Mary, identified with these same words, who also was present at the cross. She was the wife of Clopas and is also identified as the mother of James and Joseph. But today we will focus on Mary of Bethany. We have seen beautiful and commendable attributes of Mary of Bethany in earlier passages in the Gospels. Luke tells us about Martha flitting around like a chicken with its head cut off, busy serving others, while her sister Mary sat at the feet of Jesus, worshiping him and listening to his words. Jesus gave Martha this advice in Luke chapter 10, verses 41 through 42. And Jesus answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things, but one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen that good part, which will not be taken away from her. Of course, these 2 women were the sisters of Lazarus, the man Jesus only recently had resurrected. Jesus often spent time with this family in Bethany, which was located about 2 miles away from the Mount of Olives, not far from the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem. In this passage concerning his final visit before the cross, we see something more special than what we have witnessed before. Mary has a very expensive container of very fragrant perfume. It is pure nard, also known as spikenard, and the cost of it was the equivalent of 1 year of wages for the average worker. Mary did not just put a tiny bit on Jesus as a little dabble do ya, but instead poured the entire bottle over the head of Jesus. Mark tells us that some of the disciples were indignant based on this egregious waste of money. But John identifies Judas as the mouthpiece, and it was the complaints of Judas that pulled some of the other disciples into agreement by his statement that this money would be more useful if given to the poor. Interesting. Had we seen any interest from the disciples concerning the poor before this passage? Once again, John's additional information ties this together for us. John 12, verse 6 says this. This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box, and he used to take what was put in it. Notice that Judas already had a plan. As Jesus was headed to the cross and not to the throne, as Judas had previously thought, Judas felt that he deserved all of the money from the money box to make up for the time he had wasted in the last 3 years. Perhaps he could make some more money by betraying Jesus. Mark chapter 14, verses 10 through 11 says this. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money, so he sought how he might conveniently betray him. We need to look a little closer into the lives of two different followers of Jesus who are once again identified in these passages. First, let's look at Mary. Mary loved Jesus so much that her most valued possession did not mean as much to her as her love for Jesus. It is greatly difficult for us to understand how the 12 disciples of Jesus seemed to be caught by surprise when he was arrested, crucified, and resurrected. I don't know if they simply did not understand his obvious words, which he had spoken clearly on multiple occasions, specifically to them. I also don't know if they just did not believe those words from Jesus, or thought he made those statements metaphorically. But we do know that the enemies of Jesus also had heard these words. Most importantly, in today's lesson, we can see that Mary believed those words and acted on them. What did Mary think about resurrection? Well, certainly she believed 100% inside her heart that resurrection was possible if she had seen Jesus resurrect her brother Lazarus. When this occurred, when Jesus said that he would be resurrected, she took that statement to the bank. But in this loving gesture today, Mary, the woman who often sat at the feet of Jesus, worshiping him, worshiped Jesus in a different manner. She anointed him for the grave. The love of Mary exhibited that day should be a lesson to all of us. Someone wrote a book called How to Be a Mary in a Martha World. And it is true that our world can be quite challenging to find the time to get off the hamster wheel of life, sit at the feet of Jesus, and worship him. But truly, there is nothing more important in our lives than worshiping Jesus. The other things we do might have earthly value, but worshiping Jesus has heavenly implications and consequences. Jesus spent 3 years walking with these 12 disciples, and we can notice that none of them worship Jesus with the same depth of love that Mary does. Certainly, their love came later, as they were willing to give their lives because of their love for him and their belief in him. But the other person we need to look at more closely is Judas. Once again, Judas was the only disciple who was not Galilean. It is unlikely that the motives of Judas ever were anything more than self-driven. Judas might have believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and with that belief, wanted to become involved with the Messiah because doing so would increase his own wealth and power. As mentioned before, most Jews equated the role of the Messiah with that of a political ruler, and that ruler would need underlings to help in the governance of Israel. It is likely that Judas never mentioned his goals, but that had been a part of his plan all along. Let's read the last passage today, and this is from Mark chapter 14, verses 12 through 26, that says this. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare that you may eat the Passover?" And he sent out 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the city, and a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him. Wherever he goes in, say to the master of the house, 'The teacher says, where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' Then he will show you a large upper room, furnished and prepared. There make ready for us." So his disciples went out and came into the city and found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. In the evening he came with the 12. Now as they sat and ate, Jesus said, "Assuredly I say to you, one of you who eats with me will betray me." And they began to be sorrowful, and to say to him one by one, "Is it I?" And another said, "Is it I?" He answered and said to them, "It is one of the 12 who dips with me in the dish. The Son of Man indeed goes just as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had never been born." And as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many. Assuredly I say to you, I will no longer drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. As Christians, most tend to disassociate this Jewish tradition exhibited when the disciples shared this Passover dinner. This event is called a Seder and is filled with memories of what God accomplished when he removed the Jews from slavery in Egypt. On that last night in Egypt, the 10th plague occurred, and it involved the firstborn dying. This included both people and animals, unless the blood of the lamb had been placed on the doorpost of that house. This death would occur. In the Old Testament, God instructed the Jews to celebrate this feast throughout your generations. That means forever. On that night, even now, Jews go through a book called the Haggadah, which means order. It contains songs, psalms, and Old Testament scriptural references that memorialize this event. Every single aspect of the event of that first Passover and the ceremony of that event points forward to what Jesus would accomplish on the cross. Sadly, very few Jews are aware of this. The blood of the Lamb spared many lives on that first Passover night, but that was nothing in comparison to the number of lives who would be saved by the spilling of the blood of the Lamb of Jesus on the cross. In the middle of the Passover feast of the disciples, Jesus announces to all that he will be betrayed. As mentioned before, an enemy cannot betray an enemy. We expect that behavior from an enemy. Only a friend can betray a friend. It is very likely that when Jesus identified Judas as the one who would betray him, that changed everything in the plans of the Sanhedrin. Once again, the Sanhedrin did not want to arrest and kill Jesus during the feast week. They had decided to do this after the crowd left Jerusalem. But now, with Judas identified as the betrayer, it was obvious to Judas and to the Sanhedrin that Jesus was aware of their plans. They decided to begin their plan earlier than planned and take care of this immediately. God's timing revealed it was his plan all along. Exact. On the anniversary of that Passover many years before, when the blood of the Lamb of God was responsible for sparing the lives of the firstborn in each Jewish household. Paul reminded us with this statement from 1 Corinthians 5:7. "Therefore purge the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. One of the reasons that the Sanhedrin had delayed this until after the Jews from outside of Jerusalem returned to their villages was the fear of an uprising, as the Sanhedrin incorrectly assumed that the people supported Jesus, just as they had supported John the Baptist. But the Sanhedrin had overestimated the supporters of Jesus. God did not overestimate this number, as he gave these words to Isaiah. Isaiah 49:7 says this, "Thus says the Lord, the Redeemer of Israel, their Holy One, to him whom man despises, to him whom the nation abhors, to the servant of rulers, kings shall see and rise, princes also shall worship, because of the Lord who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel, and he has chosen you." Isaiah 53:7 says this, "He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him." The fickle mob that had blessed Jesus and cheered for him less than a week before would call for his crucifixion. The Jewish leaders would do the same. Pontius Pilate would say that he found no cause in this innocent man, and then would call to have him crucified. But everything is different than it appears. Jesus was rejected, but we also can see how much he was loved by Mary. That love would grow, and it continues today with all true believers. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him, reminds us of the pleasure of the Father that would come from the relationship of every believer who would follow Jesus. It did not end at the cross, it began at the cross, because he loved us first. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.